Ava Sullivan had never truly belonged in the Sullivan household. She was an outsider from the moment she stepped into their home at 8 years old, holding onto a suitcase far too big for her small hands. Her father had died suddenly, leaving her with Margaret, his second wife, and Jessica, the daughter he had with her. Ava was the child of his past, a lingering presence Margaret tolerated rather than embraced. From the very beginning, it was clear Jessica was the daughter that mattered. While Jessica was adored, praised, and given every advantage, Ava was simply there. Not outright mistreated, just overlooked, neglected in ways that cut deeper than cruelty. When Jessica got new clothes, Ava got hand-me-downs. When Jessica received praise for mediocre achievements, Ava's successes were brushed aside. When Jessica demanded, she received. When Ava needed, she was told to stop being ungrateful. But the worst part? Ava wanted to believe she could earn their love. For years, she worked harder, pushed herself to be better, hoping that if she proved she was worthy, Margaret would finally see her as a daughter. She stayed quiet when she was overlooked, swallowed the unfairness, endured the favoritism, because deep down, she hoped. Then came the letter. Ava walked into the house after an exhausting shift at the bookstore, the weight of the day settling into her bones. The second she stepped inside, she felt it. The air was heavy, suffocating. Margaret stood in the center of the living room, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line of fury. Jessica sat curled on the couch, shoulders hunched, her lower lip trembling in an all-too-familiar performance. And on the coffee table, an official-looking envelope with a university seal. Ava's stomach twisted. Margaret snatched the letter and shoved it toward her, the paper crumpling in her grip. "This is your fault." Ava blinked, thrown off balance. "What are you talking about?" "Jessica has been expelled," Margaret hissed, her voice shaking with anger. "She was caught cheating on her exams. And it's because of you." Ava stared, unable to process the absurdity of the accusation. "How's that my fault?" Jessica sniffled, eyes glassy with crocodile tears. "I just wanted to be as good as you," she whimpered. "You're always perfect, always making me feel like I'll never measure up. I just wanted to keep up." The words hit Ava like a physical blow. It was always like this. Every time Jessica failed, every time she made a mistake, Margaret found a way to twist it, to pin the blame on Ava. When Jessica got caught stealing money from a classmate, Ava was scolded for not setting a better example. When Jessica threw a tantrum over Christmas gifts, Ava was the one reprimanded for ruining the holiday. Now, Jessica had cheated, and somehow it was still Ava's fault. "I had nothing to do with this," Ava said, her voice firm, refusing, for the first time, to take responsibility for something she hadn't done. Margaret's face contorted with fury. "Don't talk back to me," she snapped. "Why?" "Because I'm finally telling the truth." Ava shot back, something inside her cracking, breaking. "Because I won't take the blame for Jessica's mistakes anymore." The slap came fast, sharp. The impact burned against Ava's skin, but she barely felt it. What hurt more was the realization settling into her bones. Margaret never saw her as a daughter. She was a burden. A mistake. A problem Margaret had been forced to deal with after her father's death. Jessica would always be her real daughter. Ava? She was just the unwanted reminder of a marriage Margaret wished had never existed. Ava looked between them, Margaret, breathing heavily, still seething. Jessica, watching with wide eyes, waiting for her to fall back into place, to apologize, to bend. But for the first time, Ava didn't bend. She straightened, lifting her chin. "I'm done," she said, voice steady. Margaret scoffed, following Ava's gaze as she turned toward the door. "You're leaving? You have nowhere to go." Ava didn't respond. She walked to her room, the smallest one in the house, barely furnished except for the essentials. Her hands moved on autopilot, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag, grabbing the few things that were truly hers. Then, she saw it, a small, framed photo of her and her father. A much younger version of herself, beaming, before she had learned what it meant to be unwanted. She took it. When she stepped outside, the night air was cold, wrapping around her like an unfamiliar embrace. Behind her, Margaret's voice rang out. Go ahead. You'll come crawling back when you realize you have nothing. Ava didn't turn around. She clutched the strap of her bag tighter, forcing one foot in front of the other, even as the weight of what she had done crashed over her. $60. A change of clothes. A single photograph. That was all she had. But for the first time in her life, she was free. Ava Sullivan had never felt more certain of anything in her life. She was leaving. She had spent 24 years being the family scapegoat, the one who always sacrificed, always bent, always broke so that Brianna could shine. But tonight, for the first time, she had refused to take the blame. She had looked her mother in the eye and told the truth. Brianna cheated, and that wasn't her fault. The words still echoed in her head, a battle cry she had never dared to voice before. But as she shoved clothes into her worn duffel bag, stuffing in whatever essentials she could grab, reality settled in like a cold weight pressing against her chest. Where will I go? The thought threatened to break her, but she forced herself to push forward. Anywhere but here. Her hands trembled as she reached for her wallet, flipping it open to count the emergency cash she had managed to hide from her mother's prying hands over the years. $60. That was all she had. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Then, a flicker of hope. She grabbed her phone and logged into her bank account, the savings account she had built up since she was 14, working every summer job, every miserable holiday shift, just so she could have something for herself. It was the one thing Margaret couldn't touch, the one piece of security she had left. Or so she thought. Ava's breath hitched as the balance loaded. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she scrolled through the transaction history, her hands shaking so violently that she nearly dropped her phone. The withdrawals were all there, one after another, draining her savings dry. And the name attached to every single one? Margaret Sullivan. Her mother had taken everything. Concert tickets, designer clothes, private tutors for Brianna. All paid for with Ava's hard-earned money. Ava clutched the edge of the dresser, nausea rising in her throat. Her mother hadn't just stolen her money, she had stolen her future. Every late-night shift, every missed outing with friends, every sacrificed moment of her youth, all for nothing. Margaret had ensured that when Ava left, she would have nothing to stand on. Bile burned the back of her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't stay here. Shoving her phone into her bag, she zipped it shut and walked out of her room. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard it, her mother's voice drifting from the living room. She'll be back in a week, Margaret scoffed. Where else is she going to go? She's got nothing. Brianna giggled, the sound sharp and cruel. Yeah, let her go. She thinks she's so much better than us. Let's see how long she lasts on her own. Ava's fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She stepped out the front door without a single word. The night air hit her like a slap, cold, crisp, and unfamiliar. The moment she shut the door behind her, she felt it. Freedom, but also fear. She walked through the neighborhood she had spent her entire life in, past houses with warm lights glowing from the windows, families settling in for the night, completely unaware that she was unraveling. Her feet ached, but she kept moving. Hours passed, and the familiar streets blurred into commercial districts, the hum of traffic mixing with the occasional chirp of crickets. Her stomach twisted in hunger, but she refused to touch the $60 in her pocket. Who knows when I'll see money again? The exhaustion hit her all at once. Ava spotted the dull glow of the 24-hour train station up ahead. Not safe, exactly, but shelter. Better than nothing. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the empty waiting area. A few people lingered, an old woman clutching a plastic bag filled with clothes, a man in a business suit sprawled across 3 seats, snoring. In the far corner, someone muttered to themselves, rocking back and forth. Ava found a spot near the vending machines and sank onto the cold tile floor. Her body ached. Her stomach growled. Her mind raced. She curled her arms around her knees, pressing her forehead against them, willing herself not to cry. Crying wouldn't fix anything. The night stretched on, endless and merciless. Every footstep jolted her awake. Every crackling announcement over the PA system made her heart pound. Sleep was impossible. By the time the first hints of dawn crept through the grimy windows, Ava felt like a ghost of herself. Her throat was raw, her head pounded, and when she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the station's glass doors, she barely recognized the girl staring back at her. Wrinkled clothes, tangled hair, hollow eyes. She looked like the kind of person she used to see on the streets and wonder, how did they end up there? Now she knew. One bad night. One moment of standing up for yourself. One realization that the devil you know is worse than the devil you don't. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She swiped it away, hard enough to sting. Crying wouldn't help. Nothing would help except finding work. Surviving. Her legs felt like lead as she pushed herself to her feet. If she didn't find a job today, she wouldn't make it through another night like this. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it settled in her chest like steel. She had spent 24 years surviving Margaret Sullivan's house. She wasn't about to let the real world break her now. Ava Sullivan had spent the past 2 weeks trapped in a cycle of exhaustion. Wake up before dawn. Walk to the diner. Scrub dishes until her hands were raw. Take the bus across town. Clock in at the coffee shop. Spend hours making lattes for impatient customers, their irritation simmering just beneath the surface whenever she moved too slowly. Then, finally, return to the train station, curl up in the same corner, and try to sleep with one eye open. It wasn't living, it was survival. But survival wasn't enough. She had spent 24 years working hard just to have her future stolen out from under her. If she kept going like this, she would never escape. She'd be stuck, forever one missed paycheck away from sleeping on the streets. The thought made her stomach churn, a deep, twisting fear that settled in her bones. She needed a way out. The answer came to her in the quiet hours of the night, when exhaustion made her thoughts blur and her defenses lower. A familiar scent drifted through the air, the faint trace of lavender, clinging to an old, handmade candle tucked in the corner of her duffel bag. She had grabbed it without thinking when she left home, a relic from a childhood memory she hadn't allowed herself to revisit in years. 12 years old, alone in the kitchen while her mother and Brianna were out shopping. Carefully melting wax in an old pot, pouring it into mismatched jars from the recycling bin. Watching in quiet satisfaction as each candle took shape, transforming something simple into something beautiful. It had been the one thing that was hers. The realization hit her like a spark in the darkness. Could she do it again? She had no real capital, no safety net. But she had her hands, her determination, and just enough desperation to make it work. The next morning, as she scrubbed greasy pans in the diner's kitchen, she turned to Marianne, the no-nonsense owner who had taken a chance on hiring her. "Do you know anyone looking for extra help?" she asked, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. Marianne eyed her for a long moment, then nodded. "My friend owns a coffee shop. They're short-staffed. You want in?" Ava barely hesitated. Yes! The extra job meant even longer hours, but it also meant twice the money. Twice the escape velocity. By the end of the week, she had saved just enough to take her next risk. She stood in the corner of a public library, her old laptop perched on her knees as she scrolled through an online supplier. She hovered over the place order button, doubt creeping in like a shadow. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You'll fail. You always do." Ava took a deep breath. Then she clicked. 3 days later, her tiny motel room smelled like melted wax. She measured temperatures obsessively, tested fragrances, adjusted ratios. Each candle took shape under her hands, not just wax and scent, but proof that she could create something from nothing. She set up an Etsy shop, snapping photos under the harsh bathroom light, trying to make the candles look professional. She wrote descriptions with care, choosing words that evoked warmth, comfort, peace, the things she was still learning to find for herself. And then, she waited. Days passed. No sales. She refreshed the page between shifts at the coffee shop, checking for orders in the brief moments she had to herself. Nothing. The voice in her head grew louder. What made you think anyone would want this? Then, one notification. A single candle. $12. Ava stared at the order confirmation until her vision blurred. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough to change her life. But it was proof. For exactly 8 days, she let herself believe she had a chance. And then the reviews started. Poor quality. Arrived broken. Smells like chemicals. Worst purchase ever. Amateur hour. Get a real job. At first, she thought it was bad luck. Then she saw the usernames. Margaret 1962. Brianna Shops. Her stomach twisted. She clicked on one of the reviews, her hands shaking. It wasn't just a complaint, it was personal. A direct attack on her. And when she dug deeper, she found more. A Reddit thread, her sister's username unmistakable, mocking her pathetic little candle shop. Tearing her down. They hadn't just cut her off. They hadn't just stolen from her. They wanted to make sure she never got back up. Ava's blood ran cold. She had spent her entire life bending, breaking, making herself smaller so they could shine. And they were still trying to keep her down. You look like you're plotting murder. Ava's head snapped up. Across the counter at the coffee shop, Riley, her coworker with the ever-changing blue hair and a sharp, knowing gaze, watched her with interest. She was wiping down the counter after closing, her expression open, genuinely concerned. I'm fine, Ava said automatically. Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England. Riley leaned against the counter. Spill. Ava hesitated. But something in Riley's expression, steady, unjudging, raked through her defenses. The whole story tumbled out. The candles. The fake reviews. The sabotage. Riley listened without interrupting. And then, instead of pity, her eyes lit up. Dude, you need to get on TikTok. Ava blinked. What? Riley was already pulling out her phone, arranging the sample candles on the counter. Small businesses deserve support, she narrated, filming. Let's get this girl some orders. Ava watched, certain nothing would come of it. Another dead end. Another failure. She had never been more wrong. The next morning, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 10,000 views. 20,000. 50,000. Orders flooded in. Then, buried in the avalanche of notifications and email. Brand partnerships. Lux Aroma. Subject. Partnership opportunity. Ava's breath caught. She hovered over the reply button, fear creeping in. What if Mom finds out? What if Brianna tries to take this away too? But something had changed. The voice in her head that sounded like her mother wasn't the loudest anymore. Ava Sullivan had spent years being underestimated, dismissed, and pushed aside. She had swallowed every insult, every stolen opportunity, every cruel smirk from her mother and sister. She had endured their sabotage, their relentless attempts to make sure she never climbed higher than they allowed. But they had made one mistake. They had taught her how to survive. And now, she wasn't just going to survive, she was going to win. The morning after Riley's TikTok went live, Ava's phone started buzzing nonstop. At first, she thought it was a mistake. A glitch. But as she rubbed the exhaustion from her eyes and squinted at the screen, she saw the truth. 10,000 views. Then 20,000. Then 50,000. And the numbers kept climbing. Her Etsy shop, which had sat in near silence for weeks, was suddenly flooded with orders. 50. Then 100. Then 200. Her inbox overflowed with messages, customers gushing over her candle designs, influencers asking about partnerships, wholesale buyers inquiring about bulk pricing. The sheer speed of it made her dizzy. She barely had time to process it before Riley burst into the coffee shop that afternoon, waving her phone in the air. Do you even know what's happening right now? Ava swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. I'm still trying to figure it out. Riley grinned. You're blowing up. People are obsessed with your story. Some girl in New York said she cried watching the video. Another person commented that they just bought 5 candles because, and I quote, "screw toxic families, support people who break free." Ava's heart pounded. People weren't just buying candles. They were supporting her. For the first time, she wasn't just a background character in someone else's story. She wasn't just a workhorse, a scapegoat, a faceless shadow standing behind her sister's golden glow. She was someone. And she wasn't going to waste this chance. That night, she turned her tiny apartment into a full-scale production zone. Wax melted on the stove in double batches. Scents filled the air: lavender and sage, vanilla and sandalwood, cinnamon and honey. Every available surface was covered in drying candles, stacks of shipping boxes, and rolls of packing tape. She barely slept, her body aching from the long hours, but exhaustion had never felt this good. By the end of the week, she had shipped out over 500 candles. Her hands were blistered from tying twine bows. Her back screamed from bending over for hours. But she couldn't stop grinning. For the first time in her life, she was building something that was truly hers. Then came the email that made her heart stop. From Brand Partnerships, Luxe Aroma. Subject: Collaboration Opportunity. She read it 3 times before it sank in. A luxury fragrance company, a company she had admired for years, wanted to collaborate with her. Ava exhaled slowly, gripping her phone tighter. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was success. And she wanted more. So, she went all in. She poured every dollar she made back into the business, investing in better materials, designing a real brand logo, hiring a freelance photographer to make her products look like something out of a magazine. She expanded her TikTok presence, sharing snippets of her journey, from the struggles to the victories. She talked about her past, not in a way that begged for pity, but in a way that resonated with people who had felt the same pain. The response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in. "I've never related to someone more in my life. Your candles feel like home. I don't even know you, but I'm proud of you. Just bought one because I want you to win." The orders kept growing. The collaborations rolled in. And then, one day, her mother called. Ava didn't answer. She stared at the name flashing on her screen, fingers hovering over the decline button. She didn't need to pick up to know what it was about. Margaret and Brianna had seen it. They had seen her success. They had watched her rise from nothing, from the ashes they had left her in, and now they were scrambling, trying to figure out how to insert themselves back into her life. But Ava didn't owe them a damn thing. She hit block. That night, as she poured another batch of candles, the scent of lavender filling the room, she realized something. For years, she had thought that proving herself meant earning their approval. But she didn't need it. She had built a life without them, a future without them. And for the first time, she felt truly free. When Ava left that house, her mother and sister laughed. They were certain she'd be back within a week, broke, desperate, and begging for help. But that never happened. Instead, Ava rose higher than they ever imagined. Her candle business exploded. Her collaboration with Luxe Aroma solidified her as a serious entrepreneur, and she was making more money in a month than Margaret had stolen from her over the years. Meanwhile, Margaret and Brianna were watching their world crumble. At first, it was just small cracks, an overdue bill, a late payment notice. But without Ava around to cover the gaps, the financial strain became impossible to ignore. Margaret, used to a life of spending without consequence, refused to change her habits. She kept swiping her credit card, convinced she'd find a solution. She never did. The bank notices piled up. One day, a letter arrived that sent a cold chill through the house. 3 months behind on the mortgage. Foreclosure was imminent. Margaret panicked. That house was everything to her, her status, her pride, her sense of control. And now it was being ripped away. She turned to Brianna, expecting her to step up. But Brianna was dealing with her own downfall. After being expelled for cheating, she had assumed she could still land a cushy job. She had always been the golden child, always had doors open for her. But when she started applying, she quickly realized that no one was willing to hire her. Her past followed her everywhere. A simple background check exposed everything: the academic dishonesty, the whispers about her entitled attitude. No one wanted to employ a known cheater. She was left with nothing. No degree, no skills, no prospects. And then, the money ran out. With no income and the house slipping from their grasp, Margaret and Brianna had only one option left: Ava. The calls started coming, one after another. First, they were casual check-ins. Then, they became more insistent. Margaret, we need to talk. Margaret, I know you're busy, but this is important. Margaret, you can't turn your back on your family. Ava never responded. Then, one evening, as she was finishing a batch of candle orders, there was a knock at the door. At first, she ignored it. But the knocking didn't stop. She set down her work, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. And when she opened it, there they were. Margaret and Brianna stood outside, looking like strangers. Brianna's once perfect appearance was gone. Her hair was a mess, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly. Margaret, the woman who had always held herself with an air of superiority, now looked older, smaller, like the weight of her own mistakes had finally settled onto her shoulders. They had once believed Ava would be the one to come crawling back. Now, they were the ones standing on her doorstep. Ava leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "What do you want?" Margaret forced a smile. "Ava, sweetheart, can we talk?" Ava didn't move. "About what?" Brianna spoke first, her voice hoarse. "We need help." Ava raised an eyebrow. "And what does that have to do with me?" Brianna swallowed hard. "I know I wasn't a good sister. I was jealous. I was wrong. But I didn't think you'd actually make it without us." Ava tilted her head. "And now that I have?" Silence. Margaret stepped forward, her tone shifting to something softer, almost pleading. "Ava, no matter what's happened, we're still family. Family helps each other." Ava let out a short, humorless laugh. "Help? And what exactly did you do to help me?" Margaret opened her mouth, but Ava didn't give her the chance. "Was it when you drained my savings? Or when you watched me struggle, working 2 jobs just to survive? Or was it when you laughed at me every time I tried to stand on my own?" Neither of them answered. Brianna's voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, Ava. I have nothing left. No job, no money. I just need a chance." Ava looked at them one last time. 2 people who had once held power over her. They had controlled her, used her, discarded her. And now, they were the ones begging. She had imagined this moment before, seeing them like this, watching them crumble. She had thought it would bring her satisfaction. But she didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel pity. She felt nothing. "I don't owe you anything." Her voice was calm, steady. Margaret's lips parted. "Ava, you can't just turn your back on us." Ava met her gaze without flinching. "I'm not turning my back on my family. You were never my family." And with that, she stepped inside and closed the door. Behind it, she heard Brianna's sharp intake of breath, heard Margaret's shaky exhale. But the sounds didn't matter anymore, because Ava wasn't the one who had been left behind. This time, they were. Ava sat in her office, the soft hum of the city below filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sunlight glinted off the polished marble floors, casting long shadows against the sleek furniture she had carefully curated, pieces that spoke of power, of success, of a life built entirely on her own terms. She had come so far. Once, she had been a girl with nothing but $60 and a duffel bag, walking into the night with no idea where she was going. Now, she was the owner of a thriving business, a brand that had taken over the luxury market, and a woman who had proven that she didn't need them. Which made it almost poetic when her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Miss Sullivan, there are 2 women here asking to see you. They say they're family." Ava knew before she even asked. "Send them in." The glass doors swung open, and there they were. Margaret and Brianna. Her mother and sister walked into the space as if they didn't quite belong, their eyes flickering over the luxurious surroundings, taking in every detail. Margaret, always the picture of composure, was dressed in clothes that, while expensive, no longer had the pristine elegance they once held. The fine lines on her face were more pronounced now, her usual air of superiority dampened by something Ava had never seen before: hesitation. Brianna, on the other hand, looked worse. Gone was the perfectly styled hair, the flawless makeup, the effortless confidence. Her eyes darted around the room, her hands twisting together as if she wasn't sure whether to play the role of victim or sister. For a long moment, Ava didn't say anything. She simply looked at them. Not with anger. Not with pity. Just detachment. "You've done well for yourself," Margaret finally said, forcing a smile, though the tension in her jaw betrayed her discomfort. Ava didn't return the smile. "I have." Brianna stepped forward, her voice softer, carefully measured. "Ava, we're sorry. For everything." Ava tilted her head, watching them, but she didn't respond. Margaret cleared her throat, filling the silence. "We made mistakes. I can admit that now. But you're in a position to help, Anne. Help." Ava cut in, the words sharp, deliberate. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather armrest. "Like the way you helped me when you took every dollar I saved? Like how you helped me when you watched me struggle and did nothing?" Margaret flinched. Brianna spoke up quickly. "I know I was awful to you. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm trying. She swallowed hard. "I just need a chance." Ava let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "No, you don't. You don't need a chance. You need an escape. And I'm not giving it to you." Margaret bristled. "Ava, you're being unreasonable." Ava's gaze snapped to her mother, her voice dropping to a quiet, cutting edge. "Unreasonable?" She stood, her presence commanding, forcing them to look up at her. "Was it unreasonable when you laughed at me while I was working 2 jobs just to afford a place to sleep? Was it unreasonable when you stole my future right out of my hands?" Silence. Margaret's fingers clenched around her purse. Brianna looked down, shame flickering across her face. Ava exhaled, the fight leaving her. They weren't worth it. Not anymore. Instead, she reached into the drawer of her desk, pulled out a crisp white envelope, and placed it on the sleek glass table between them. Brianna hesitated, then stepped forward and picked it up. She opened it, her hands shaking as she pulled out 2 slips of paper. Her face twisted with rage. "Bus tickets?" Ava nodded. "Back to where you came from. Where you belong." Brianna's breathing grew ragged, her shoulders shaking as she stared at the tickets like they were an insult, like they burned in her hands. Margaret, however, just stood there. She understood. This was the end. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, in one violent motion, Brianna ripped the tickets in half. "You think this is funny?" she snapped, her voice rising, full of fury and humiliation. Ava didn't flinch. "No, Brianna. I think it's mercy." Brianna let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head, but Margaret didn't move, didn't speak. She knew there was nothing left to say. This was the moment she had spent years avoiding, the moment she had never believed would come. Margaret had played the game for so long, always staying one step ahead, always manipulating, always taking. But now, she had nothing. Ava stepped around the desk, walking toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She pulled it open and stood there, waiting. Margaret and Brianna lingered for a moment. Then, slowly, Margaret turned. Without another word, she walked out. Brianna stayed a moment longer, her breathing still uneven, her hands still shaking. She opened her mouth as if to say something, maybe another plea, maybe another insult, but in the end, she just swallowed, clenched her fists and followed. Ava shut the door behind them. She stood there for a moment, the silence stretching through the room. Then she let out a breath. It didn't feel triumphant. It didn't feel like revenge. It just felt like peace. She had spent years waiting for them to see her. Now, she realized, it didn't matter anymore. Because she had already moved on. Ava Sullivan had once believed that revenge meant watching her mother and sister suffer the way they had made her suffer. She had imagined the satisfaction of seeing them fall, of knowing they had lost everything. But when that moment came, when Margaret and Brianna stood before her, broken and begging, she had felt nothing. Because the truth was, she had already won. Victory wasn't about destroying them. It was about living a life they could never touch. Now, as she stood in the headquarters of Lunar Lux, the candle empire she had built from nothing, she understood that success wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving to herself that she had always been capable. Her company had grown beyond anything she had imagined. Lunar Lux was stocked in high-end boutiques, featured in luxury magazines, and had a waitlist that stretched for months. But the greatest thing she had built wasn't just a business, it was a mission. With her success, Ava launched the Phoenix Project, a program designed to support young women escaping toxic family environments. It started small: mentorship, financial literacy courses, resources for those who, like her, had once walked away with nothing. But it grew quickly, gaining partnerships with shelters, universities, and advocacy groups. She met girls who reminded her of herself, the ones who had been told they weren't enough, the ones who had been used and discarded, the ones who had been made to believe that they would never survive without the people who had hurt them. And she showed them that they could. One evening, as she locked up her office, she found herself standing by the window, looking down at the city. Her city. She thought about the girl she had been, the girl who had slept in a train station, who had scraped together her first few dollars washing dishes, who had been terrified of what came next. And then, she thought about the woman she had become. Independent. Powerful. Untouchable. Margaret and Brianna had once made her feel small, invisible. Now, she lived a life so far beyond their reach that they were nothing more than a distant memory. Ava smiled to herself, breathing in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had won, not because they had lost, but because she had moved on. Ava's story isn't just about survival, it's about reclaiming power. It's about learning that true victory isn't found in revenge, but in rising so high that those who once tried to break you become irrelevant. She didn't win because she watched them fall. She won because she walked away, built a life they could never touch, and never looked back. The past may shape you, but it does not define you. The people who hurt you do not get to write your ending. You do. And the best revenge? Living a life so full, so free, so successful, that they become nothing more than a footnote in your story.